Welcome back to the Stage Podcast. This is a place where we don't simply recognize our experiences, we explore the architecture beneath them. Throughout this week on the Vibe Shift Podcast, we've been asking a recognition question that quietly landed in the lives of many people. I don't feel like myself anymore. For some people, that sentence arrived almost as a whisper. For others, it landed like an unexpected truth that they have been carrying for years without having language for it. Because somewhere inside, many successful people eventually notice something difficult to explain. Life appears successful, the career may be thriving, responsibilities are being handled, people admire them, the resume continues growing, yet beneath all of that, something feels strangely absent. Not broken, not dramatic, just missing. Almost as though the person living the life no longer feels completely connected to the one who has actually began it. Today we begin going deeper than recognition. Today we are asking a question that has quietly echoed throughout philosophy, psychology, leadership, and contemplative traditions for centuries. Who was I before I learned who I was supposed to become? Not as an intellectual exercise, not as nostalgia, but because the answer changes everything. The identity we never chose. One of the greatest assumptions we make about ourselves is this: I am who I am. It sounds obvious, it feels obvious, it rarely gets questioned. But what if much of what we call me was assembled? Not intentionally, not consciously, gradually, patiently, almost invisibly, long before we had the awareness to notice it was happening. Think about it. When you entered the world, you weren't concerned about status. You weren't worried about productivity. You weren't comparing yourself to anyone else. You weren't asking whether you were successful enough. You weren't measuring your value through performance. You simply experienced life. Then something remarkable began happening. The world slowly began introducing you to itself. Parents, teachers, siblings, friends, religion, culture, school, success, failure, approval, disappointment. None of these experiences were inherently harmful. Most were attempts to help us survive, to belong, to succeed, to become functional adults. But while they were teaching us how to live, they were also quietly teaching us who we believed we needed to become. Identity is learned before it is examined. Very few people consciously decide who they are going to be. Instead, identity accumulated, like layers of transparent film placed one upon another. Each experience added another layer. You should work harder. You should be responsible. You should be successful. You should make people proud. You shouldn't disappoint anyone. Good people sacrifice. Strong people don't cry. Successful people never stop. Your worth comes from achievement. Don't make mistakes. Be realistic. Think logically. Don't be selfish. Don't stand out. Stand out. The messages often contradict one another, yet somehow we absorb all of them, not because we're weak, because human beings are extraordinary learners, especially as children. Our nervous system isn't merely learning information, it's learning belonging. It discovers something profoundly important. If behaving this way earns connection, I'll become this person. We rarely notice the bargain, because it happens before we're capable of questioning it. Success can reinforce an identity that isn't actually ours. This becomes especially interesting for high-performing professionals. Success is an unusual way of validating identity. If the identity performs well, the world rewards it. Promotions, raises, recognitions, titles, respect, responsibility, influence. Everything appears to confirm, this must be who I really am. But success doesn't necessarily validate authenticity. Sometimes it simply rewards adaptation. Think about how profound that realization is. You may become extraordinarily successful at being the person you learned would be rewarded, without ever asking whether that person reflects who you truly are. This is why so many executives eventually arrive at an astonishing levels of achievement, only to quietly ask themselves, why doesn't any of this feel like I thought it would? The question isn't about success, the question is about identity, the invisible contract. Somewhere along the way, many of us unknowingly signed an invisible contract. If I become who everyone needs me to become, then eventually I'll feel complete. It sounds reasonable until decades pass, because completeness never arrives through becoming increasingly acceptable to everyone else. Instead, the identity simply keeps expanding. Now more people depend upon it. More responsibilities attach themselves to it. More expectations accumulate around it. And eventually, the identity becomes exhausting to maintain. Not because you're failing, because you're carrying something that was never designed to define you. Awareness doesn't attack identity. This is where many people become afraid. They hear conversations like today's and imagine we're suggesting they eliminate everything they've built. Walk away from success, abandon responsibility, reject family, leave their careers. Not at all. Awareness isn't destructive. Awareness is revealing. Imagine standing in a museum looking at a beautiful stained glass window. For years you've admired the colors, the patterns, the artistry. Then one day someone quietly points beyond the glass and says, "Notice the light." Suddenly, something extraordinary happens. The window doesn't disappear. You simply realize it has never been the source. The light has always been there. The glass simply expressed it differently. Identity is much the same. The roles aren't the problem. The stories aren't the problem. The career isn't the problem. The personality isn't the problem. The problem begins the moment we mistake the stained glass for the light itself. The question that begins transformation. Perhaps this week's deepest question isn't who am I? Perhaps that's still too large. Perhaps awareness begins somewhere much gentler. What if we simply became curious enough to ask what parts of me were discovered and which parts of me were inherited? Because that question doesn't attack your identity. It simply begins examining its architecture, and every authentic transformation begins there. Not by becoming someone new, but by gently recognizing what may never have belonged to you in the first place. Closing into part 2. In part 2, we're going to explore something even more subtle. If much of identity is inherited, who is the one becoming aware of the inheritance? Because awareness itself may be pointing towards something far deeper than personality. And once you begin recognizing that, your relationship with yourself can never be quite the same again. Part 2. The one who is aware is not the story. A quiet shift begins. In part 1, we explored the possibility that much of what we call our identity wasn't consciously chosen. It was learned. It was shaped. It was reinforced through relationships, achievement, responsibility, and the countless experiences that taught us how to survive, belong, and succeed. For many people, that realization alone is profound, but it naturally gives rise to another question. If much of my identity was learned, who is noticing that? Who is becoming aware of the conditioning? Who is observing the inherited beliefs? Who recognizes that something no longer feels authentic? That question marks one of the most significant turning points in self-awareness, because the moment you notice the story, you are no longer completely inside the story. The observer was never lost. Many professionals describe a season in life where they begin saying things like, "Something has changed. I don't feel like the person I used to be. I don't know what's happening to me. The things that used to motivate me don't anymore." Often they assume something is wrong. They wonder if they're burned out, depressed, unmotivated, or somehow losing their edge. Sometimes those things are indeed present and deserve thoughtful attention. But there's another possibility that is rarely discussed. What if nothing essential is disappearing? What if something deeper is becoming visible? Because there has always been a part of you that quietly observed every stage of your life. The child, the student, the young professional, the ambitious achiever, the parent, the leader, the caregiver, the exhausted version, the hopeful version, the fearful version. Each identity came and went, yet something remained present through every one of them, the one who noticed. Awareness has been with you all along. Think back to your earliest memories. Perhaps you're 5 years old, playing in the yard, riding a bicycle, walking into your first classroom. Even though your personality has changed dramatically since then, there is something strangely familiar about those memories. Not because your circumstances remained the same, they didn't. Not because your beliefs remained the same, they certainly didn't. Not because your appearance remained the same, it didn't. The familiarity comes from something much quieter. The awareness experiencing those moments feels remarkably continuous. Life has changed, roles have changed, goals have changed, relationships have changed, but awareness has quietly accompanied every chapter. Like the sky behind changing weather. Storms arrive, clouds gather, sunlight returns, seasons change. Yet the sky itself is never damaged by the weather moving through it. Executives know this experience better than they realize. This is especially relevant for leaders and high-performing professionals. Throughout your career, you've likely held many titles: manager, director, vice president, founder, CEO, partner, consultant. Perhaps you've even changed industries entirely. Every title required a different set of skills, a different way of communicating, a different way of leading, different responsibilities, different expectations. And yet, after every promotion, after every organizational change, after every new role, you remained. The title changed, the awareness did not. Unfortunately, over time, many people begin confusing the role with the person. The position becomes the identity. Performance becomes self-worth. Responsibility becomes personality. Achievement becomes proof of existence. Eventually, when the role begins shifting or disappearing altogether, it can feel as though life itself is unraveling. Retirement, career transitions, empty nesting, health challenges, organizational restructuring. Suddenly, the question arises, if I'm no longer the role, who am I? This discomfort isn't simply about change. It's about discovering how completely identity became attached to something temporary. The difference between identity and presence. Imagine standing on the shore of a lake. The surface reflects whatever passes overhead: blue sky, dark clouds, birds, wind, rain. At times the water is perfectly still. At other times it's filled with ripples. The reflections are constantly changing, but the lake itself remains. Much of what we call identity is like those reflections. Thoughts, emotions, successes, failures, opinions, achievements, disappointments. They arise, they pass, they change. Awareness is more like the lake itself, capable of reflecting every experience without becoming limited to any single reflection. This distinction matters, because if we mistake the reflection for who we are, our sense of self rise and fall with every circumstance. But if we begin recognizing ourselves as the awareness within which those experiences occur, life becomes remarkably different. Not easier, but steadier. Why awareness feels so unfamiliar. One of the paradoxes of this journey is that awareness often feels unfamiliar at first. Not because it's new, because it's been overlooked. Most of us spend decades directing our attention outward, toward achievement, toward expectations, toward solving problems, toward managing responsibilities, towards becoming. Very little of our education teaches us how to simply observe ourselves, how to notice our thinking without immediately believing it, how to experience emotions without becoming defined by them, how to recognize roles without mistaking them for identity. So when awareness begins emerging, it can initially feel like uncertainty, but uncertainty isn't always a sign that you're lost. Sometimes it's a sign that old certainties are gently dissolving. You are not becoming someone else. Many people fear that questioning identity means losing themselves. The opposite is often true. You're not becoming someone different, you're becoming less identified with what you are not. Imagine wearing a heavy winter coat for decades. Eventually, you stop noticing the weight. It simply feels normal. Then, one warm spring morning, you take it off. For a moment, the lightness feels strange. Not because something has been lost, because something unnecessary has finally been released. Awareness works much the same way. It doesn't remove your intelligence, your ambition, your compassion, your leadership, your responsibility. It simply loosens the unconscious belief that those things are the entirety of who you are. And in that spaciousness, something remarkable begins to emerge. Not a new identity, a more authentic relationship with every identity you inhabit. The architecture begins to change. This is where transformation quietly begins. Not through dramatic reinvention, not through abandoning your life, not through rejecting success. Transformation begins when identity shifts from being a prison to becoming a tool. You still lead, but leadership is no longer who you are. You still achieve, but achievement no longer determines your worth. You still care deeply, but responsibility no longer requires carrying the entire world on your shoulders. The role remains, the attachment softens. The performance continues, the pressure begins to dissolve. This is not withdrawal from life, it's a deeper participation in life, because now your actions arise from clarity rather than compulsion, from presence rather than performance, from awareness rather than unconscious conditioning. Closing into part 3. In part 3, we'll bring the entire conversation together. We'll explore why rediscovering yourself isn't about returning to the person you once were. It's about recognizing the presence that has quietly accompanied every version of you throughout your life. And we'll discover that perhaps the deepest freedom isn't found by creating a better identity, but by remembering what has never needed one in order to be whole. Bringing the journey together. Throughout this week, we've been exploring a question that, at first glance, seems almost impossible to answer. Who was I before I learned who I was supposed to become? It's a beautiful question, but perhaps it's not one we're meant to answer in words. Perhaps it's a question we're meant to live. Because if you've been listening carefully throughout this conversation, you may have noticed something subtle. We've never been trying to uncover a forgotten personality. We've never been searching for the old you. We've never been suggesting that somewhere back in childhood there was a perfect version of yourself waiting to be recovered. This isn't the invitation. The invitation is much deeper. The invitation is to recognize what has quietly remained present through every version of you that has ever existed. You were never meant to stay the same. One of the greatest misconceptions about identity is that belief that authenticity means remaining unchanged. We say things like, I just want to get back to who I used to be. But would you really? Would you want to carry only the understanding you had at 20? The emotional maturity you had at 30? The certainty you had before life humbled you? Perhaps not. Life has shaped you. Loss has shaped you. Love has shaped you. Leadership has shaped you. Failure has shaped you. Success has shaped you. Parenthood, friendship, illness, healing. Every experience has contributed something meaningful. The goal isn't to erase those experiences. The goal is to stop mistaking them for the entirety of who you are. Growth doesn't require abandoning your history. It simply asks that you stop living as though your history is your identity. The executive illusion. This may be especially challenging for those who have built successful careers, because the professional world often rewards certainty, confidence, competence, expertise, results. There is nothing inherently wrong with those qualities. Organizations need capable leaders. Communities need responsible people. Families need dependable individuals. But over time, something almost imperceptible can happen. The role begins expanding beyond the workplace. The executives don't simply lead meetings, the executives become the ones who must always know. The caregiver doesn't simply care for others, they become the one who can never need care. The high performer doesn't simply produce excellent work, they become the person whose value depends upon continuing to produce. Eventually, the role is no longer something you do, it becomes someone you believe you are. And that is where exhaustion quietly begins. Not because leadership is exhausting, not because success is exhausting, but because maintaining an identity 24 hours a day eventually requires enormous psychological energy. Awareness creates choice. The beautiful thing about awareness is that it never forces change. It simply creates possibility. Before awareness, our reactions often feel automatic. Someone criticizes us, we immediately become defensive. A challenge appears, we immediately begin proving ourselves. An expectation is placed upon us, we automatically accept it. Not because we consciously chose these responses, because they become part of the identity we've inherited. Awareness interrupts the automation. It creates a small but profound space, a space between the experience and the identity that immediately wants to respond. Within that space, choice is born. You begin asking questions you may never have asked before. Is this actually mine to carry? Am I responding from wisdom or from conditioning? Is this decision aligned with what matters now or with who I've spent years believing I needed to be? Those questions don't weaken leadership, they refine it. They don't reduce effectiveness, they increase intentionality. They don't make you less capable, they make your capabilities more authentic. Living from presence instead of performance. Imagine beginning each day without immediately stepping into a performance. Imagine entering meetings without unconsciously needing to prove your intelligence. Imagine listening without preparing your defense. Imagine succeeding without requiring success to validate your worth. Imagine resting without guilt. Imagine saying no without believing you're disappointing the world. Imagine allowing yourself to be fully human without experiencing it as a failure. That isn't complacency. That isn't lowering standards. That is freedom, because performance can become an extraordinary expression of who you are, once it is no longer responsible for providing who you are. There is a profound difference between living through your gifts and living to justify your existence through your gifts. One creates fulfillment, the other creates chronic pressure. The architecture beneath every core problem. One of the reasons we've created the growing Core Problems Library is because we've discovered something remarkable. Many of the struggles we experience appear different on the surface. I can't turn it off. I've been pulled in every direction. I don't know what matters anymore. I don't feel like myself anymore. They sound like separate problems, but beneath them the architecture is often remarkably similar. Each one points towards a version of ourselves that has become so intertwined with thinking, performing, striving, pleasing, or achieving that we've forgotten to question the identity carrying those burdens. That's why recognition is so powerful. When you recognize the pattern, you stop fighting isolated symptoms. You begin understanding the structure that creates them. And once you begin seeing the architecture, you no longer unconsciously living inside of it. This week's invitation. So rather than ending this episode with advice, I'd like to leave you with an observation. Over the next few days, simply notice the moments when you instinctively describe yourself. I am the responsible one. I am the strong one. I am the successful one. I am a fixer. I am the provider. I am the one everyone depends upon. Don't judge those identities. Don't try to eliminate them. Simply become curious. Ask yourself, when did I first learn this about myself? Who taught me that this was who I needed to become? And what part of me has been quietly observing this story all along? You don't need immediate answers. Awareness begins with honest questions. And often those questions gently dissolve what years of effort could never change. The journey continued. If today's conversation resonated with you, it isn't the end of this week's exploration. It's only one part of it. Earlier this week on the Vibe Shift podcast, we explored the lived experience of realizing I don't feel like myself anymore. That conversation focused on recognition, helping you notice the experience many successful professionals carry quietly without having words for it. Here on the Stage podcast, we've explored the deeper architecture beneath that recognition, exploring how identities are formed, inherited, reinforced, and eventually mistaken for who we are. These two conversations are designed to work together. One helps you recognize the experience. The other helps you understand the structure beneath that experience. And now we have brought both together in this week's Vibe Shift blog, where you'll find an integrated exploration and a practical framework for beginning to live from awareness rather than inherited identity. That's where this week's transformation becomes personal. You'll also find the growing Core Problems library, where each exploration builds upon the last, revealing how many of our most persistent struggles share common patterns beneath the surface. And if this week's conversation has opened something deeper within you, I also invite you to explore VSP number 4, where we continue this journey with an even richer exploration of identity, awareness, and the quiet freedom that begins when you stop confusing the role you've learned to play with the life that has always been present beneath them. Closing. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Stage Podcast. Until next time, remember this. Perhaps the most important discovery you will ever make isn't becoming a better version of yourself. It's recognizing that beneath every role, every achievement, every expectation, every success, every failure, every identity you've ever carried, there has always been a quiet presence that never needed to become someone else in order to be whole. And perhaps that has been you all along.